February 1941. RAF Bomber Command issued explicit orders, reconnaissance only. Flight Lieutenant James Hartley, navigator aboard a Bristol Blenheim, read the directive 3 times. His crew was to observe enemy positions over the North Sea, photograph German coastal installations, and return. Nothing more. But Hartley had lost his brother over Dunkirk, his childhood friend during the Blitz, and 17 men from his own squadron in 3 months. When his pilot spotted 40 Luftwaffe bombers forming up to strike Liverpool's dockyards, Hartley made a decision that would either win him a court-martial or change the course of the air war. What happened next defied every regulation in the RAF handbook and saved thousands of British lives. The operations room at RAF Waddington stank of cigarette smoke, stale tea, and desperation. It was 5:47 hours on February 12, 1941, and the thermometer outside read -4 degrees Celsius. Flight Lieutenant James Hartley stood before the mission board, his breath forming clouds in the inadequately heated briefing room. The coal ration had been cut again. Everything had been cut again. Group Captain Morrison's voice cut through the murmur of assembled air crews. "Gentlemen, surveillance runs only. The Air Ministry has been explicit. We need intelligence on German naval movements off the Dutch coast, photographs, positions, fleet compositions. You will not, I repeat, will not engage enemy aircraft unless directly attacked. We cannot afford to lose reconnaissance aircraft on offensive operations. Is that understood?" 23 heads nodded. Hartley's stomach twisted. For 6 months, RAF Bomber Command had operated under impossible constraints. Too few aircraft, too little fuel, too many targets. The Luftwaffe had been hammering British cities with methodical brutality since September. Liverpool's docks, the Atlantic lifeline, had been struck 17 times. Convoys were being massacred in the North Sea. British shipping losses had reached 320,000 tons in January alone. Every reconnaissance flight that returned with photographs was valuable. Every bomber lost on a gamble was a disaster. Hartley was 26 years old, born in Manchester to a postal worker father and a schoolteacher mother. He'd studied mathematics at Cambridge before the war, planned to become an actuary, spent his weekends playing cricket and reading detective novels. Now he calculated death probabilities and navigated through flak-filled skies. His navigator's table was covered with charts, compasses, rulers, and a photograph of his younger brother Geoffrey, killed when his Spitfire went down over the Channel 8 months prior. The briefing continued. Weather conditions deteriorating. Cloud cover at 3,000 feet. Visibility 4 miles. Enemy fighter activity moderate to heavy. Expected return time 11:30 hours. Any questions? Morrison's gaze swept the room with the weariness of a man who'd sent too many boys to their deaths. No one spoke. What was there to say? You followed orders, you did your job, and you hoped the odds favored you today. Hartley had flown 47 operational sorties. Statistical analysis suggested his probability of survival was declining exponentially with each mission. But statistics didn't account for the human factor, the variable that couldn't be quantified in equations. At 06:15 hours, Hartley climbed aboard Bristol Blenheim F. Freddy with his crew, Pilot Officer Thomas Wickham, a stocky Yorkshireman who flew with mechanical precision, and Sergeant Peter Davies, the air gunner, a Welsh coal miner's son with reflexes sharp enough to track a sparrow at 200 yards. They'd flown together for 9 months, survived situations that killed better-equipped crews, developed the telepathic understanding that kept men alive. The Blenheim's twin engines coughed to life with their characteristic ragged snarl. The aircraft was obsolete by 1941 standards. Too slow, too lightly armed, too vulnerable. But Britain was fighting with what it had, not what it wished it had. Wickham taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and pushed the throttles forward. The Blenheim lurched down the concrete strip, lifted reluctantly into the grey dawn, and climbed through layers of cloud that turned the world into shifting gradations of grey. Hartley hunched over his navigator's table in the cramped fuselage, plotting their course with practiced efficiency. Heading 87 degrees, airspeed 220 mph, wind from the northwest at 15 knots, estimated time to observation point, 47 minutes. He marked waypoints on his chart, calculated fuel consumption, monitored the compass with obsessive attention to detail. Navigation was mathematics made visible. Angles, distances, velocities converging into certainty. They crossed the English coast at 07:02 hours, leaving behind the patchwork fields of Lincolnshire. Below, the North Sea stretched away in cold, metallic waves. This was the killing ground, where U-boats stalked convoys, where Luftwaffe bombers formed up before striking British cities, where men drowned in water so cold it killed in minutes. Hartley had seen ditched aircraft floating like broken toys, had watched parachutes descend into that freezing void, had calculated how many minutes a man could survive and wished he hadn't. At 07:49 hours, they reached the observation point, 60 miles off the Dutch coast, positioned to intercept German formations heading west. Wickham throttled back, circling at 8,000 feet, whilst Hartley peered through the observation window with binoculars, scanning the horizon. Cloud layers complicated visibility. Patches of clear sky alternated with grey curtains of precipitation. The sea below was empty of ships. Then Davies's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp with urgency. "Aircraft, 10 o'clock low, multiple contacts. Jesus Christ, skipper, there's dozens of them." Hartley swung his binoculars left and down. His blood turned to ice water. 43 aircraft, he counted them twice, were forming up in loose formation at 5,000 feet. Heinkel He 111 bombers, the Luftwaffe's workhorse. They were assembling in attack formation, heading west-northwest, heading directly towards Liverpool. "Reconnaissance only," Wickham said quietly, reading Hartley's mind. Morrison was explicit. Hartley stared at the formation below. 43 bombers, each carried 4,000 pounds of high explosives. That was 172,000 pounds of bombs, about to fall on Liverpool's docks, warehouses, residential streets. The last major raid had killed 370 civilians in a single night. The docks were still being rebuilt. The city was exhausted, traumatized, clinging to resilience through sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. "We need to report this," Davies said. "Get fighters scrambled." "By the time fighters reach intercept range, they'll be over the target," Hartley replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. 43 bombers, unopposed. The mathematics were clear, the consequences were clear, and so was the regulation: reconnaissance only, do not engage. Hartley closed his eyes briefly, saw Geoffrey's face, heard his brother's voice from their last conversation. "Do something that matters, James. Don't just calculate, act." "Wickham," Hartley said slowly, "take us down through that cloud layer. Attack angle. Now." Wickham's hands froze on the controls. "You're ordering me to violate direct orders from Group Captain Morrison." "I'm suggesting," Hartley said carefully, "that the tactical situation has changed sufficiently to warrant combat engagement under rules of defensive necessity." "That's bollocks, and you know it," Wickham replied. But his hands were already pushing the control column forward. "This is going to be court-martial material." "Only if we survive," Hartley said grimly. The Blenheim's nose dropped, engines howling as they dove through the cloud layer towards 43 German bombers and whatever consequences awaited. The Bristol Blenheim punched through the cloud base at 6,000 feet, emerging into clear air with the German formation spread below like a textbook diagram of bomber tactics. 43 Heinkel He 111s flying in loose echelons, maintaining separation for defensive crossfire. Standard Luftwaffe doctrine. They'd been using these tactics since the Blitz began, with devastating effectiveness. Hartley's mind raced through calculations. A single Blenheim against 43 bombers. The Blenheim carried 4 303 Browning machine guns in a belly pack, Hartley's responsibility, and Davies had a single Vickers K gun in the dorsal turret. Against 43 bombers, each with defensive armament of up to 6 machine guns. The mathematics suggested this was suicide, but Hartley had spent 6 months studying Luftwaffe tactics, analyzing reconnaissance photographs, reading intelligence reports during sleepless nights in the mess. He'd noticed something the official analysts had missed. German bomber formations relied on mutual support, which meant they also created structural vulnerabilities. The echelon formation left the lead aircraft partially exposed during the critical seconds when the formation was assembling. And these bombers were still forming up, still vulnerable, still uncertain. "Wickham, come in from their 5 o'clock high," Hartley ordered. "Attack run on the lead element. Davies, concentrate fire on the port side aircraft. I'll take starboard. We're targeting the formation leaders. If we break their cohesion, they'll scatter." This is insane," Davies muttered, but his voice carried a note of grim excitement. Welsh coal miners didn't back down from impossible odds. Wickham rolled the Blenheim into a diving attack, pushing the throttles to maximum power. The aircraft shuddered, buffeted by turbulence and the strain of excessive speed. Hartley braced himself against the navigator's table, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 5,800 feet, 5,600, 5,400. The German formation grew larger with terrifying speed. At 1,200 yards, the first tracers flickered past. German gunners had spotted them. Bright streams of 7.92mm rounds arced through the air, searching for range. Wickham jinked left-right, keeping the Blenheim dancing. 900 yards, 700. Close enough to see details. The mottled grey-green camouflage, the black crosses on wings, the glazed noses where bombardiers were frantically pointing at the attacking aircraft. "Firing!" Hartley squeezed the trigger for his belly guns. The 4 Brownings hammered, sending streams of 303 rounds into the lead Heinkel. Tracer rounds walked across the bomber's fuselage. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. The Heinkel lurched, dropping out of formation with smoke trailing from its port engine. Davies opened up simultaneously, his dorsal gun raking across another Heinkel. The German bomber's starboard wing erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled hard right, diving away from the formation. 2 aircraft damaged in the first pass, but the German response was immediate and brutal. 41 bombers opened fire simultaneously. The sky filled with tracer rounds, a lethal web of intersecting fire that should have torn the Blenheim apart. Wickham threw the aircraft into a violent corkscrew, twisting through the barrage with instinctive precision. Rounds hammered into the Blenheim's fuselage. Metal shrieked. The aircraft shuddered. "We're hit!" Davies shouted. "Port engine streaming coolant!" Hartley felt the aircraft's balance shift, the port engine losing power. But Wickham kept flying, compensating with throttle and rudder. "One more pass," Hartley said. "We need to break them completely." "You're bloody mad," Wickham replied, but he was already coming around for a second attack, diving through a gap in the formation that had opened when the damaged bombers fell away. The Luftwaffe pilots were reacting now, their formation dissolving into chaos. Some bombers were breaking away, seeking safety in the clouds. Others were tightening up, trying to restore defensive cohesion. The mathematical precision Hartley had studied was collapsing into confusion. This was the vulnerability, not the guns, not the armor, but the psychological impact of unexpected aggression. Hartley's second burst caught a Heinkel in the wing root. The bomber's starboard wing folded upward at an unnatural angle. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell, spinning towards the sea. Davies destroyed another with a sustained burst into the cockpit. 4 bombers down. The formation was scattering, but the odds were still overwhelming. Tracer fire surrounded the Blenheim in a cage of light. Wickham was flying on reflexes and luck, dodging fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The port engine was failing, temperature rising into the red zone. The aircraft was sluggish, responding slowly to control inputs. Then Hartley saw it. The formation was splitting. Half the bombers were breaking west, continuing towards Liverpool, but scattered and vulnerable to fighter interception. The other half were turning back towards the Dutch coast, abandoning the mission entirely. The mathematical precision had broken. The attack was disrupted. "We've done what we can," Hartley said. "Get us home, Wickham." The Yorkshireman didn't argue. He pulled the Blenheim into a climbing turn, using every bit of remaining power to gain altitude and distance. Behind them, the German formation continued to disintegrate. Individual bombers were fleeing in different directions. The coordinated strike force that would have devastated Liverpool was now a scattered collection of vulnerable aircraft. The return flight was a nightmare. The port engine failed completely at 0821 hours, forcing Wickham to feather the propeller and fly on single-engine power. Fuel consumption increased dramatically. Airspeed dropped to 140 meters. Every mile felt like an hour. The English coast appeared at 913 hours, a line of grey cliffs that looked like salvation. They landed at RAF Waddington at 0947 hours with fuel tanks nearly empty, the Blenheim's fuselage punctured by 37 bullet holes, and Group Captain Morrison standing by the runway with an expression that promised a very uncomfortable conversation. The three crew members climbed out of the battered aircraft. Davies was grinning despite a cut on his forehead. Wickham's hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Hartley felt oddly calm, the mathematical certainty of his decision settling over him like a cold blanket. Morrison approached with measured steps. "Flight Lieutenant Hartley, Pilot Officer Wickham, Sergeant Davies, my office, immediately." Group Captain Morrison's office was cramped, cluttered with maps, reports, and the accumulated paperwork of men who died under his command. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, studying the three airmen who just violated explicit orders. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. Outside, aircraft engines droned. Someone was shouting orders across the dispersal area. Life continued. 43 aircraft, Morrison said finally. "You engaged 43 German bombers with a single reconnaissance Blenheim." "Yes, sir," Hartley replied, despite explicit orders to the contrary. "Yes, sir." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Do you have any comprehension of military discipline, Flight Lieutenant? Any understanding of what happens when individual officers decide operational doctrine no longer applies to them?" Hartley met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, I understood that 43 bombers were about to strike Liverpool. I made a tactical assessment." "Your tactical assessment," Morrison said coldly, "could have resulted in the loss of a reconnaissance aircraft we can ill afford to lose, the death of 3 experienced crew members, and absolutely zero impact on the enemy formation. 1 aircraft against 43. The mathematics alone suggest this was lunacy." "The mathematics," Hartley said quietly, "also suggested that unopposed, those bombers would deliver 172,000 pounds of high explosives on Liverpool's docks. Estimated casualties based on previous raid patterns, 300 to 400 civilians. Estimated damage to port facilities, significant disruption to Atlantic convoy operations for 2 to 3 weeks, sir." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk. "Fighter Command scrambled 6 Hurricanes 40 minutes after you engaged. They intercepted the scattered German formation at 0847 hours. The bombers had broken cohesion. Individual aircraft were fleeing in multiple directions. Fighter Command destroyed 11 more German aircraft and drove off the remainder. 0 bombs fell on Liverpool. 0 British casualties." Hartley said nothing. Wickham and Davies remained at attention. "Radar stations tracked the engagement," Morrison continued. "They counted 5, possibly 6, German bombers destroyed or severely damaged during your initial attack. German radio intercepts showed complete confusion. The formation commander was ordering his aircraft to regroup, but half his force had already broken off. The attack was disrupted before it reached British airspace." Morrison set down the paper. "Intelligence section spent the morning correlating reports. German bombers destroyed or damaged in your engagement. Verified 5. Probable kills. 2 more crashed into the North Sea during the return flight with engine damage. That's 7 aircraft. Fighter Command accounted for 11 more. Total German losses, 18 aircraft, the largest single-day loss for Luftwaffe bomber units in 3 months. The silence returned. Hartley could hear his own heartbeat, feel sweat cooling on his back despite the cold office. "The problem," Morrison said slowly, "is that you violated explicit orders. I cannot have officers deciding independently when regulations apply. That way lies chaos." He paused. "However," the word hung in the air. "However," Morrison continued, "the Air Ministry has taken a keen interest in this engagement. They're analyzing how a single aircraft disrupted a formation that should have overwhelmed it. The psychological impact of aggressive action against superior numbers. The vulnerability of bomber formations during assembly. Your Navigator's assessment," he nodded at Hartley, "identified a tactical weakness we hadn't fully appreciated." Morrison stood, walked to the window overlooking the dispersal area. "Berlin radio is screaming about a coordinated fighter ambush over the North Sea. They're claiming they fought off 20 RAF fighters. They haven't admitted, perhaps haven't realized, that the attack was initiated by a single reconnaissance bomber. Their own formation discipline collapsed because they panicked." He turned back to face them. "The Luftwaffe has been operating on assumptions of superiority, assumptions that their formations are invulnerable to light attacks, assumptions that British aircraft will follow predictable defensive patterns. You shattered those assumptions. German bomber crews now know that even reconnaissance aircraft might attack. That uncertainty changes their operational calculations." Morrison returned to his desk, picked up another document. "Air Ministry is recommending immediate implementation of new tactical doctrine. Reconnaissance aircraft are now authorized, not ordered, but authorized, to engage enemy formations when tactical conditions suggest significant operational advantage. Your engagement is being studied as the template." Wickham's eyes widened. Davies looked stunned. Hartley felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. "You're not being court-martialed," Morrison said. "You're being studied. Intelligence section wants detailed debriefs, tactical analysis wants your engagement broken down minute by minute. Training command wants your approach documented for other crews." He paused. "There's talk of a commendation, though I'll be buggered if I understand recommending someone for violating orders." "Sir," Hartley said carefully, "with respect, I wasn't trying to establish doctrine. I was trying to stop bombers from killing civilians." Morrison's expression softened fractionally. "I know, Flight Lieutenant, and that's why you're still in my office rather than in a cell, but intention matters less than consequence. Your consequence was disrupting a major German operation and forcing them to rethink their tactical assumptions. That's worth more than following regulations." He sat down again, suddenly looking exhausted. "Dismissed. Get cleaned up. Report to intelligence section at 1400 hours. And Hartley, try not to make a habit of this. My nerves can't take it." The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Intelligence officers, tactical analysts and training specialists crowded into a conference room, peppering Hartley, Wickham and Davies with questions. Diagrams were drawn. Trajectories were calculated. The engagement was reconstructed with obsessive precision, every second analyzed, every decision questioned, every outcome measured. What emerged was a fundamental reassessment of bomber interception tactics. The Luftwaffe had been operating on assumptions that their formations were essentially invulnerable to light attacks. German tactical doctrine emphasized mutual defensive fire, assuming that any attacking aircraft would be overwhelmed by concentrated firepower. This created psychological dependency. Bomber crews felt safe within the formation, unsafe outside it. Hartley's attack had exploited that psychological vulnerability. By attacking during formation assembly, the vulnerable transition period when defensive coordination was incomplete, He'd created confusion that cascaded through the entire force. Individual pilots, faced with unexpected aggression, made individual decisions to break away. Once the formation's structural integrity collapsed, it couldn't be restored. The bombers scattered not because they'd been destroyed, but because they'd been demoralized. "The mathematics are fascinating," noted Squadron Leader Price from Tactical Analysis. "The physical damage was minimal, 5 confirmed kills, 2 probable. But the psychological damage was catastrophic. The entire formation dissolved. That's a force multiplier we hadn't fully quantified." The implications rippled through RAF operational planning. Within 3 weeks, a new tactical memo circulated through bomber and fighter commands. Reconnaissance aircraft were authorized to engage enemy formations when circumstances suggested the attack would disrupt enemy operations. The emphasis shifted from pure destruction to psychological disruption, creating uncertainty, exploiting vulnerabilities, forcing enemy pilots to make defensive decisions that compromised their missions. German bomber formations began showing signs of increased caution. They assembled further from British airspace, increased fighter escorts, showed hesitancy when encountering even small numbers of RAF aircraft. The confidence that had characterized Luftwaffe operations during the Blitz's peak was eroding, not because of massive force deployment, but because of uncertainty. In May 1941, the Luftwaffe redirected bomber forces eastward for Operation Barbarossa. The strategic rationale involved multiple factors: Hitler's obsession with Russia, the failure to break British resistance, the need for resources that only conquest could provide. But operational assessments cited increasing vulnerability of bomber formations over Britain, rising loss rates, and declining operational efficiency. The Blitz ended not with dramatic climax, but with gradual recognition that the campaign wasn't achieving strategic objectives at acceptable cost. Hartley continued flying operational sorties through 1941 and into 1942. He survived 73 missions, a statistical anomaly that suggested either exceptional luck or exceptional skill, probably both. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross in August 1941, the citation carefully worded to commend exceptional tactical initiative and aggressive spirit in combat operations, without explicitly mentioning disobedience. Wickham was promoted to flight lieutenant, eventually commanded his own squadron. Davies received the Distinguished Flying Medal, continued as an air gunner until 1943, survived the war, returned to Wales, went back to the coal mines, because that's what you did. They remained friends until Davies died in 1987, Wickham in 1992. Morrison was promoted to Air Commodore in 1942, spent the rest of the war in increasingly senior planning roles. After the war, he wrote a memoir that included a chapter on the tactical value of calculated disobedience, using Hartley's engagement as the primary example. "Military discipline exists to create order," he wrote, "but order without initiative is rigidity, and rigidity in combat is death. The art of command is knowing when to enforce regulations and when to recognize that circumstances have rendered them obsolete." The long-term tactical impact proved Morrison's point. RAF operational doctrine evolved throughout the war, incorporating increasing emphasis on flexibility, initiative, and psychological warfare. The rigid formations that characterized early war bomber operations gave way to more adaptive tactics. The recognition that morale, cohesion, and psychological resilience were as important as firepower became central to operational planning. In 1968, newly declassified documents revealed the full extent of German bomber losses on February 12, 1941. 18 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The attack on Liverpool completely disrupted. German operational reports showed sustained confusion about what had happened. Some reports claimed fighter ambush. Others suggested coordinated anti-aircraft defenses. None correctly identified a single reconnaissance bomber as the initiating cause. Hartley lived until 1994, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 79. He'd returned to mathematics after the war, became an actuary as originally planned, lived quietly in Cambridgeshire with his wife Margaret and their 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, avoided publicity, declined interviews. When pressed, he'd smile slightly and say, "I was doing my job, nothing more." But in private conversations, with people he trusted, he occasionally reflected on that morning over the North Sea. "I didn't think about heroism," he said once. "I didn't think about legacy. I thought about Geoffrey. I thought about Liverpool. I thought about doing something that might matter." The mathematics suggested it was suicide, but some things aren't calculable. Some decisions can't be reduced to equations. You just act and hope the consequences justify the choice. The Blenheim Freddy survived the war, was scrapped in 1946. A piece of its fuselage, containing several bullet holes, is preserved at the RAF Museum in Hendon. The plaque reads, "Bristol Blenheim Mackay 4, serial number T1892. Participated in engagement over North Sea, February 12, 1941, resulting in disruption of major Luftwaffe bomber operation. Crew, FLT LTJ, Hartley, DFC, POT, Wickham, Sergeant P, Davies, DFM. 40 enemy aircraft engaged, formations scattered, mission disrupted, countless lives saved. One navigator who calculated the odds, ignored regulations and changed history. Britain's finest hour wasn't fought only in the skies over Kent or on the streets of London. It was forged in split-second decisions by ordinary men who refused to accept the unacceptable. If James Hartley's story of calculated disobedience and quiet heroism resonated with you, smash that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more untold stories from the war that defined a generation. Drop a comment below. Would you have made the same choice? History rewards the bold. Don't miss our next episode. Cheers.